All righty. Good morning, everybody. Happy Veterans Day. So if anybody on here has served, or your friends or family or loved ones have served in any of our armed forces, please extend our gratitude for serving our country and protecting our freedoms. So we will go ahead and kick off for our HR Council meeting this morning, and would like to welcome everybody that's attending, but most importantly, I'd like to welcome our speaker for this morning, Marc Freedman. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. He is from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and will be informing us and educating us on the Department of Labor independent contractor rules. So Marc, if you want to give us a little background about yourself, kind of some of your history, and then enlighten us, please.
Certainly. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Well, as Bethany was describing, I'm with the U.S. Chamber, and my role is to work on labor and employment policy issues. And specifically, I cover the issues under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which brings me to this regulation. Fair Labor Standards Act is the big law passed in 1938 that has given us minimum wage and overtime. I also do a lot of work on OSHA matters, the paid leave issues, the EEOC issues, and generally other duties as assigned. I've been with the chamber now as of October for 18 years. So I've seen quite a bit, and quite frankly, I've been privileged and excited to be with the chamber for, I think, just about all that time. So I'm glad to be with you this morning. And this morning, we're going to talk about a newly proposed regulation from the DOL that will describe how to classify workers as either independent contractors or an employee. Some of you may remember that this issue has been a little bit of a hot potato over the years, and in particular, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, during the Trump administration, they issued a regulation on this matter, and now the Biden folks want to get rid of that regulation and replace it with one of their liking. I've sometimes joked that the first job of the Biden administration Department of Labor is like those ads you see for Service Master that talk about the disasters, and they say like it never ever happened. And frankly, that's what the Biden Department of Labor is trying to do. It's trying to make it like the Trump Department of Labor never ever happened. So this is another one of their efforts to undo and replace what the Trump administration had done. If we can move on from this slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's a really brief top line summary of what this proposed regulation does. As I mentioned, it repeals the Trump administration's regulation. It reinstates what's called the economic realities test, and we'll certainly talk about that in detail. And in doing so, it goes into detail and discussion about each of the different factors under that test. And the final note is that there was originally a 45-day comment window. They extended it to 60 days, so that deadline is now December 13th. We've actually asked for a further extension. We haven't heard anything about that yet, and to be honest with you, I'm not optimistic that we'll get it. But in any event, the new deadline for comments is December 13th. It was in the October 13th Federal Register, if some of you want to go find it. That underline indicates that it should be a link to that date of the Federal Register if you want to find it, but trust me, that's why you folks have me around. You don't need to go read this stuff yourself. Next slide, please. Can we get the next slide? Thank you. So I mentioned that they wanted to get rid of the Trump 2021 independent contractor regulation. We supported that regulation when it came out as a proposal. We liked it. We thought it did a good job of giving employers a very clean analytical framework to use in determining whether someone was an independent contractor or an employee. In particular, it highlighted two factors as the most important, that being the who controls the work and the opportunity for profit or loss. And by highlighting those, it gave everybody a sense of what was most important And then if you didn't get a clean answer out of those two, you could go to the other factors. They tried to rescind this regulation literally like the moment they walked in the door, but the process they used for it did not provide adequate comment period, and so a federal judge struck down their rescission and reinstated the Trump regulation, which is actually the regulation that's in effect right now. It will be in effect until the Biden administration replaces it with the regulation that we're going to be discussing. But as part of the proposal, they do explicitly undo and rescind the Trump 2021 reg. Can we get the next slide, please? So this is the key phrase here. It's all about this idea of whether the worker is economically dependent on the company, or are they able to survive on their own? And importantly, this isn't a question of how much income that person may be earning. It's really the relationship of around that worker and the company for whom they're doing the work. You may hear this sometimes called the economic realities test. Economic dependence is the same thing. Next slide, please. This regulation relies on what's called a totality of the circumstances analysis, which means, as I was describing a little bit a moment ago, it doesn't weight any of the different factors differently. So in the Trump reg, we had 2 factors that were given the greatest weight, and all the other factors were underneath those. In this one, it takes 7 different factors and says they're all the same, and you, employer, have to work through all these different factors and figure out where they lead to in terms of the question of being an employee or independent contractor. The problem with this is employers will not be able to tell whether they've properly classified someone as an independent contractor based on this structure, because they don't know which factors the Department of Labor is going to consider most important against which factors they may have considered most important. And so it really leaves a big, huge question and level of uncertainty for employers. Now, we talk a lot about trying to classify someone as an independent contractor. If you decide that someone actually should be classified as an employee, you can rest assured you're on safe ground. The Department of Labor is never going to come by and second guess a classification of somebody as an employee. That's where they want you to land. So if you decide that someone is an employee, you can be sure that the Department of Labor is going to say you're right. But if you decide that someone should be an independent contractor, you may have to justify that decision. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the factors. So here we go. There's 7 specific factors that the department identifies that are to be considered when determining whether someone is a worker, whether someone's an employee or an independent contractor. They're listed here. We'll now go into them in detail. Let's move forward, please. Next slide. So the first one is called opportunity for profit or loss based on managerial skill. And I think the thing to understand here is the managerial skill component. The way the department looks at this, it's really about whether that worker is exercising managerial role in the work they're doing. So if you look at these different factors, can you set the rate of pay? Can you accept or decline work? Do you do marketing or advertising, related to that work specifically? Can you hire others, purchase stuff, or are you renting space? And then, do you have the opportunity to experience a financial loss beyond just reducing pay? So, a financial loss, it would be something like, you've invested certain amounts of money and then the business goes dry and you're on the hook. That's not just a reduction in pay. That's like a serious financial loss. So the department wants to look at the question of managerial skill in terms of whether you have an opportunity for profit or loss. So it's a fairly complicated type of analysis. Next slide, please. This is another one that, let me cut to the chase here. As we go through these different factors, the way the department talks about them reveals a bias towards finding an employment relationship. I mean, they certainly set it up in a way that companies going through this analysis might find support for independent contractor, but they make these tests relatively challenging, and by doing so, they basically make it easier to find an employment relationship than an independent contractor relationship. So this is another one. So it asks, has the worker invested, what kind of investments have they made in this whole enterprise? And you might note in that major bullet there that owning a car, use of a personal vehicle, is not considered an investment. Guess who they're going after there? Our friends at Uber and Lyft, and that type of thing. And so they're really trying to identify people who have made significant investments in their enterprise beyond just things that they already owned. And they also want to compare, in some cases, whether your investment looks like the investment of the company. I mean, how much did you invest versus the company invest in your activities? So you may think on the surface this isn't a hard test to meet in terms of independent contractor status, but they're making it more challenging than you might imagine. Next slide, please. Okay, so here again, another one of these little tests here. And they're looking at the degree of permanence of the relationship. So how, is this person, do they have a long-standing relationship with a company? Is it constantly renewed? Those are the kind of factors that make that person look a lot more like an employee. And the way that the department describes this, they've actually sort of tried to have their cake and eat it too. So they note that exclusivity, so working exclusively for one company, would be a factor against independent contractor. But then they also go on to say, yeah, but if that company or that industry historically uses these types of people on a sporadic basis, then that really doesn't give them any benefit towards being an independent contractor. We think that may still cut towards being an employee. It's almost damned if you do, damned if you don't type of equation under this factor. So again, as I said, a lot of these things end up cutting more towards employee status than independent contractor status. Next slide, please.
Real quick before I move on to the next slide, I want everybody to know that
Please.
Mark has sent me this PowerPoint as a PDF, and I will get it out to all of you. So if you're frantically getting hand cramps trying to write all this information down, please give yourself a break this morning on the holiday morning, and we will get that information out to you. Thank you.
Or for some reason you have trouble falling asleep tonight. Actually, this will keep you awake, so I don't recommend reading this as nighttime reading. Nature and degree of control. So this is one of the factors that's always been part of the independent contractor employee analysis. And there's no surprise it shows up here. They've really broken it out into several different components. And you'll see that a lot of these components, again, tend to favor finding an employee status. I want to note one phrase here, and we'll talk about this in detail a little bit later. And they say that, the factors look at the level of control, including this concept of reserved control, which is a very unsettling concept and one which is not otherwise defined. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But just going through the elements of control. So we have, I think, 5 of them. The first is, who schedules the work? And, that's sort of an obvious question of control. And they look at it and they say, it's more than just whether the employee chooses to work, but, can they choose when to work? Can the business tell them that they can't work with somebody else? And again, that feeds into the second one, ability to work for others. So, if you're a true independent contractor, you should be able to work for multiple companies at the same time, or at least, at other times. And that's one of the things that goes to the question of control. Can we have the next slide? I think an obvious question of control is supervision. So this is identified here. And it says, in some cases, you may not get an answer from who controls the work, because in some cases you don't really need to exercise control or supervision of that work. But here again, and this feeds into that reserve control concept. Note the little bullet down there about the right to exercise supervision, even if that exercise supervision is not used. What the hell does that mean? You're a company and you say, well, we're not going to come down on you hard, but we want to make sure you do what you're supposed to do. And that concept of right to exercise supervision goes towards the finding of an employment relationship. And it's very amorphous. Moving on, I mean, obviously, how you price the work is something that would indicate the nature of control. And in this case, they want that independent contractor to be able to set their own prices, or at least be able to negotiate about it in a meaningful way. If not, then you're more likely to look like an employee. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is the last of the slides on nature of control. This is a real sticky one here. So, in many situations, an independent contractor would have to abide by various legal requirements, workplace safety, various other things that the company itself has to abide by, and they're just going to pass that on to the independent contractor. Well, by doing so, the Department of Labor is saying that in some cases, this may make it look like that person's an employee. It's crazy because you're just following the legal requirements, but in some cases, I'm not going to say all, but this is how the Department of Labor phrases it. They may see that as indication of controlling that person in a way that they look like an employee. And then finally, back down to this reserved control concept. It's a new phrase. It does not show up anywhere else. And it's very problematic. I don't know if any of you followed the debate around the joint employer rule in the National Labor Relations Board context, but there's a famous case now called Browning-Ferris that introduced the idea that two employers could be considered joint based on mere indirect or potential control. Again, a very open-ended, amorphous concept, but this concept of reserved control looks very much like that and is equally troubling. So it's one of those things where the Department of Labor can sort of find reserved control where they want to, if they want to decide that you should have classified someone as an employee. Okay, and I should have noted earlier, and I'm happy to take any questions if people have them as we move through these, but obviously we'll have time for questions at the end. So by all means, I'm happy to respond to whatever your thoughts and concerns are. So let's move on. Next slide, please. So this one is really, I think, going to be a tricky one for people to work with. This idea that, whether the work performed is integral part of the business. Well, what does integral mean? If that person is producing the goods or services that the business is known for, then you're going to be seen as an integral part of that business, and that's going to lean towards finding an employment relationship. But there are lots of functions that companies outsource to independent contractors that you might argue are integral to the operation of that company. I'm thinking here of sales representatives or accounting services or IT functions. All these things are how companies operate, but a lot of times they don't want to have employees. They don't want to bother with having employees doing that. They'll contract with somebody on the outside to do that. It could be a solo person as an independent contractor. What constitutes an integral part of the business is going to be a real big question that people are going to have a hard time answering. Can a company function without accounting services? Probably not. Can you function without, an HR service that you've contracted out? I wouldn't want to try to do that. So, it gets really dicey in this discussion. Some of you may be familiar with what happened in California. And California has now what's called an ABC test, named for the three provisions, A, B, and C. And it is a very stringent test for whether someone can be an independent contractor. Under the ABC test, you have to meet all three of those conditions to be considered an independent contractor. Well, this talk about whether someone's an integral part of the business looks in some ways like the reverse of the prong B of that ABC test. Prong B says to be an independent contractor, the worker performs work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. Well, the reverse of that is the worker performing work that's integral to the course of the business. And so in this case, it brings in, that component of the ABC test, which is very worrisome. I should note here as a digression that many people were concerned that the Department of Labor would do the ABC test through this regulation. They have admitted that they can't do that through a regulation, that would require a legislative change. But even so, in this one function, in this one component of the control question, they have in some ways sort of brought in elements of that ABC test. Excuse me. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please. Skill and initiative. I mean, I think this is sort of, I wouldn't say obvious, but maybe a little easier to digest. Again, thinking about our friends at Uber and Lyft, courts have said driving is not a specialized skill. That's who we're thinking about there. Can we have the next slide, please? And now we come to one of these signature moments of this regulation. There is, in addition to the 6 well-described factors, a 7th called other factors that are deemed relevant. I've nicknamed this the bonus factor. And this is as open-ended as it sounds. They don't define this in any way. The way you would understand this is presumably if they can't get to where they want to go, the Department of Labor can't get to where they want to go, they can cast about looking for something else that will support their decision. What that is, you won't know until they find it. So it's really, I think, a very troublesome and concerning factor, since it doesn't appear in any history of this regulation. They just say, oh yeah, we have a catch-all thing that says, okay, fine, if we haven't found something yet, we'll look for something else. That's not how you're supposed to write regulations. Okay, I think we have one more slide there. Yep. So just to try to tie all this stuff up together, the gig economy folks are going to get the headlines on this regulation. And I think it's probably fair to say that in writing this, the Department of Labor was looking to use this as a way to go after the high-profile gig economy companies, where the independent contractor model has really become their business model. And, everyone talks about independent contractors because the gig economy companies have relied on them and brought them sort of into the forefront. But as I think everyone understands, independent contractors have been used for decades and throughout the economy in lots of different settings. And so the impact of this regulation is really much broader than just the way it's going to affect the gig economy companies. And they'll get the headlines, but people have to appreciate how much broader the impact of this regulation is going to be. As I've tried to suggest and really not gone into great detail about, when you read the regulation, particularly the preamble material where they talk about this stuff and explain what they want to get, it really does reveal the bias towards finding an employment relationship. The Department of Labor can go after the illegitimate independent contractor uses that are already out there. They love to cite the example, apparently multiple examples of restaurant dishwashers who have been labeled independent contractors. And we all know that that's a bad, that's an illegitimate use of the independent contractor status. And, they don't need a new regulation to go after those bad examples. What they want this regulation to do is to literally give them an opportunity to get more people declared as employees. In their mind, employment the employee-employer status is the preferred status, and they believe that more people should be considered employees than are currently being considered employees. And that's not just the cases where you have illegitimate uses of the independent contractor model. They just think it should be more the case than it is now. I should note that this is all about the Fair Labor Standards Act. Because, independent contractor services in several other different legal arenas, but this is specifically for the Fair Labor Standards Act purposes. And somebody asked, well, what are the penalties? The penalties come in the form of back wages that you may have owed an employee or may have owed a worker if they're found to have been an employee, not an independent contractor. Those back wages could include minimum wage violations or overtime violations. And, those can get pretty hefty depending upon how long that person was not properly classified. And as I've noted earlier, just a final note, this really does leave employers with a great deal of uncertainty if they classify a worker as an independent contractor. From the totality of circumstances analysis where everything's weighted the same, you don't know which factor the Department of Labor is really going to want to highlight. The reserve control language could mean just about anything. And certainly, as I pointed out, that any other factors under the sun component could certainly be anything, and things that the employer had not, figured out were important. So this is going to create a lot of problems for employers. And as you can imagine, the Chamber of Commerce is going to be on this, really hard. We're working with outside counsel right now to develop our comments. We will certainly be very active in the rulemaking process, and there's certainly a strong chance that we'll be involved in some type of legal challenge. I'm not going to say that with any degree of certainty, but that we'll be considering that option. So with that, I am through with these slides and happy to entertain any questions or thoughts people may have. Have I put you back to sleep? Has everybody?
No, at least not me. So
how
Mark,
can you sleep after this? It should be.
I know, right? So, talk about. I know one of the people that came to me that was upset about this. It is a realtor. So how is that going to impact, say, realtors, hairdressers, these these companies that have functioned under this very well under this independent contractor model for their entirety of their existence, pretty much?
Great questions, and that's where I want to, I note that this is going to have an impact much farther and wider than just the gig economies. And you're right, real estate companies are all about the agents being independent contractors, and those are good examples of people who willingly accepted the role of independent contractor because it served their needs, and they were comfortable with that model. Same thing in a lot of cases with hairdressers. Who you go to a salon and the person taking care of you is probably running their own independent business. They're going to have to look closely at those relationships. I think in those cases that whether the work is an integral part of the business question is going to loom large. Mm-hmm. You go to a hair salon, you're working with an independent hairdresser. Well, they're doing what that salon's supposed to be providing. That's going to look an awful lot like, that may shade towards an employer relationship. Same thing with the real estate agent. Real estate agents are selling houses under the big banner of the company. Well, that company's there to sell houses, and that's what that person's doing. I think they're going to have to look closely at those relationships. And, again, this whole 6-factor, 7-factor analysis says that you go through all these different questions and you decide how they stack up against the two outcomes. So, okay, integral, part of the business may lean towards employee, but investment may lean towards independent contractor. You may get a mixed bag as to how these things shake out. And as the company, you would say, well, on balance, we have X number of factors over here, we have X number of factors over here, and therefore we decide that this person should be classified, let's assume for the sake of discussion, as an independent contractor. And you've got an analysis that says how you got there. Now, the question is, if somehow because somebody complains or the Department of Labor decides to get curious, they come in and say, well, let's see how you classify these people. And you say, well, we weighted these factors over here, we weighted, and they're gonna say, nah, we think integral part of the business is more important than, this other thing over here. There you go. That's why I say you're gonna have uncertainty. And that's why this regulation is really, I think, going to be a problem for employers to work with in terms of getting them to a place of comfort and clarity about the decisions they're going to make. But you raised two very good examples. Those industries clearly have relied on independent contractors for a long time in a successful way, in a way that all parties supported and were happy to move forward with.
So what other questions? Most of the people on here are HR professionals, so let's pepper Mark with questions.
I don't know if I have.
This is going to be your life going forward. So a quick note on process, just to get that out of the way. So this is a proposed regulation. It's open for comment. I would encourage all parties to look at this and decide whether they want to say something. The U.S. Chamber is going to do our own comments, and we are also preparing a document that's going to circulate through the different state and local chambers for them to sign on. So we'll give you the opportunity to register your concerns, or be on the record as saying we don't like this. And then so the comment period presumably closes on December 13th, unless they extend it, and then they'll go back and chew on these comments. And my joke is, one of these days when I have too much time in my hands, I'm going to submit a regulatory comment, and I'm going to give the Department of Labor what they're going to respond to my comments with. Because we can all pretty much predict how they're going to say, well, and the Chamber of Commerce said the following and we disagree. So they're going to come back with their version. They may tweak some things. Maybe they realize that language about the seventh factor is ridiculous, and they can't really keep that up. So maybe they take that away or something like that. They'll come out with their final regulation somewhere down the road. I can't tell you when. And then it will, there'll presumably will be some type of implementation period, and then it'll go into effect, and people will have to live under that regulation. Right now, the regulation in effect, the law of the land is the Trump administration issued independent contractor reg. So the Department of Labor is enforcing under that reg, and that's the one that you should be paying attention to in terms of classifying your workers as independent contractors or employees. At some point, this Department of Labor expects to replace it with the proposal we just discussed. So that's the process questions. Just get those out of the way.
Yeah, Mark, I appreciate you going through this information. We are currently in the midst of an exercise of looking at some of our classifications, whether it's seasonal, internships, co-ops, full-time regular, part-time regular. We've gone through this exercise, and we have some, what I will call teammates that have retired, and they're not interested in any type of benefits, but they like to work part-time, and talking to those managers of, okay, this person's been part-time working for 18 months. Somebody could look at that and be like, that is an employee.
They're doing the same job they were doing. They're doing the same job they were doing when they were an employee.
Yes, for the most part.
Yeah.
But it's part-time. But
you want to be careful there.
Yes, exactly. Like an engineering position. And so what's funny is trying to educate the managers of, well, the managers are saying the teammate's fine. They're perfectly happy with the relationship. They don't have any issues. They're not looking for benefits. And my job from the HR perspective is to educate them that it doesn't matter what the teammate or former teammate or temporary person feels. It's in case anywhere else in the organization somebody questions their status, Department of Labor is going to come in and look at all of our teammates, and we have to mitigate that risk when they come and say, maybe that one teammate that complained, they really are an independent contractor, but now that they've audited all of us, we don't meet the right criteria for these other 5, no matter how happy they are with their employment status. If we don't meet the correct criteria, we've put ourselves at risk for all
That,
kinds
that
of
that's
issues.
that's exactly right. And you know, one of my little sayings is that there's no such thing as a single plaintiff overtime case.
Oh, no.
You know, there will always be multiple employees who qualify under that same analysis, and so it gets expensive very quickly.
Yes.
And you know, I usually at some point in these conversations say something like, "Look, I'm not in a position to give anyone legal advice, but I will tell you this: if you're using an independent contractor model, and even now, currently under the current regulation, you have to be darn sure it's airtight.
Yes.
This is where you use your outside counsel to make sure that
Yes.
it survives scrutiny, because it isn't just because I don't want to pay that person benefits. It's, you know, they really have to be, they have to meet some type of indicia of being an independent contractor.
Yep.
And I think you've just raised a classic example, and one that, you know, you would be wise to get on top of now.
Yeah. Yes.
Before things get more hairy.
Yes. That's why we've audited now, and we have plans
Yeah.
on how to go forward, whether it's asking for
Yeah.
additional headcount and they're a part-time regular teammate, or if they meet that criteria to be an independent contractor.
You bring up a classic scenario. Both parties are comfortable with the relationship. These people who are doing the work for you really aren't looking for anything more, but that's not the final answer.
Nope. Nope.
And
The DOL does not care about that.
That's going to be the challenge.
Yep.
So yeah, good luck with that one.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the information. It was very helpful.
Hope to see you on a future call.
Mark, I have a question. My name is Billy Luceni Baker, and I work for Premier Health, which is a large healthcare system. And as many of you may know, just from the course of events over the last couple of years, agency usage within hospitals has increased exponentially because of the nursing shortage in many areas, but in particular in nursing. And many organizations for years have contracted with a VMS, a vendor who subcontracts with other agencies, and consequently provides us contract staff or contract, I'll just use nurses in this example, but those nurses are actually employed by the agency. What we are seeing in the market is a shift to a different model because the agency need continues across the country for clinical staff. New companies are creating new models whereby they develop a marketplace that directly connects a hospital and a nurse. And through that connection, then the hospital has an independent contractor relationship with that nurse.
So they bypass the middle person.
Taken out.
So the agencies are no longer in the game. You just go straight to the people who are going to provide the service.
Right, taking out the middleman, and thereby, and obviously taking out some of that additional cost associated with the agency.
Sort of like the gig economy Uber model, where people who want to be picked up as nurses put themselves into this big algorithm, and you go out and find them.
Correct, and so we haven't officially entered into a relationship yet with a company like that, but I am just curious if you've seen that anywhere else, particularly in healthcare, or what your thoughts or opinions might be, or what we need to be very cautious about.
Yeah, I'm certainly not familiar with it, from my own understanding, but I can see how it would operate based on your description. And I think you all have some serious questions to work through. I go back to that, is the work an integral part of your operation question? Well, hospitals
Yes.
don't do very well without nurses.
Right.
That's going to be a hard one for you to overcome and maintain an independent contractor concept there. Nature of control. I mean, you're asking these people to be there at a certain time, to do certain things according to your standards, you know, and you don't want them walking down the street and working for some other hospital. You know, that's going to look an awful lot like an employee relationship. So, you know, under that construct, the way you described it, I would think that's the type of setting that's going to certainly raise some eyebrows at the very least. And you know, let's be clear, it may even be suspect under the current regulations. You know, let's be clear, the current regulations do allow for someone to be classified as an employee. It's just a different type of analysis. But nature and degree of control is also a key factor in the current regulation. And so, you know, that may be something that would be hard to overcome even in the current environment. So, I mean, it's a clever business model. I appreciate why people would want it, but
Yeah.
you also have to be very careful with it in terms of how those people are classified.
Sure. Thank you.
Certainly. Somebody reading the sports section there, you know, on the other screen or something.
Jeff, you're in insurance. Do you guys have some independent contractors out there in the insurance world?
Oh yeah, I'll answer for him.
Quite a bit. A lot of owner operator. We do a lot of trucking insurance, so it's been very interesting, especially those that haul out to California, because with the ABC test, it's several companies or owner operators say they won't even go out there anymore because it's not advantageous for them to do that.
And you mentioned the trucking industry, and that's another one of these key industries that's really going to come under scrutiny. You know, you own your cab and then you go, you know, pick up a load of, you know, a trailer someplace. You're going to, you know, that's the kind of thing that's really going to need to be looked at closely. I mean, you know, in that case, the investment question may lead towards the independent contractor finding, because someone has to go buy their cab, and that's a big investment. That's not just your own personal car that you're driving around in. But, you know, again, to the extent that you're doing work for one company, maybe you do all your driving for one company, that exclusivity is going to start to look like an employer relationship. And your comment about California is absolutely on point. I mean, that California ABC test, and it's known by the law that enshrined it called AB5, has really chilled a lot of businesses from operating in California. I mean, we heard from somebody just this week who literally relocated from California to Arizona because they couldn't survive under the AB5 structure. And so that's the only, I wouldn't say good news, but differentiation between AB5 and what this Department of Labor regulation would do is, in the legislative process, they built in a lot of carve-outs. So there's a lot of specific industry concepts that aren't covered by the AB5 law. But in the case of the Department of Labor regulation, there are no carve-outs, so it's going to apply, you know, across the board. You know, the insurance industry is a lot like the real estate industry. You know, they have these agents that operate as independent businesses, and I think that's going to start to come under a lot of scrutiny.
You know, financial, I guess there's a lot of financial advisors and things that work under that too. You know, as you start to talk about it, the ripples of just keep going and going and going. And
that's why I say this is so much, you know, broader than just the gig economy companies. You know, that independent contractor model has been out there for a long time, and it has, you know, been, you know, infused into various industries, and it's been a profitable model for a lot of these industries. And I think in many of those situations, they're going to have to examine their operations, you know, in light of this new regulation.
Well, I'm going to jump in. I'll let Bethany close us out in a second, but first of all, Mark, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm sure Bethany will thank you again, but I'm
happy to take multiple, you know, expressions of appreciation. I'm I have an unlimited capacity there.
I want to plug two things coming up at the chamber. Next Thursday, we have Safety Council. And if you haven't registered yet, actually our speaker is going to be Christy Strasser from Everhard Hospice. And she's going to talk about her insane emergency plan crisis that happened when a landscaper hit their gas line. And the realization that they thought they knew what their emergency plan was, and everyone was just sort of running around like chickens with their head cut off. So how important it is to not only have an emergency plan, but to know what that is. So her story it's a great story. And then the Greenville Fire Department will also be with us to discuss some of those emergency plans and their part in helping you get those ready. So it's not just a safety officer, it's a good one, I think, for anybody in the company to attend. So that's next Thursday. And then don't forget to our State of the State is coming up very late this year, December 2nd. But Lieutenant Governor John Husted is going to be our speaker that day. And so we're excited. We have students coming from around the county we've invited and to participate in that day as well. And it's going to be a really good program. And I'm looking forward to hearing him speak. As if you know anything about Husted, it's that he is all about workforce. And so he'll be a great speaker. So throw it to Bethany.
Well, thank you everybody for attending. What I will plug is if you have some HR topics that you want to discuss over 2023, Peggy and I will be meeting and talking about some of those and getting those scheduled for next year. So some of the ones I've come up is just creative recruiting, HR and technology, what kind of non-standard perks do companies offer, things like sabbaticals, paid sabbaticals we don't normally see in the industry, HR analytics, using data to make decisions. So some of those that I've come up with, but would love to hear your thoughts as well. So please send that to either Peggy or myself, and we'll work on getting next year's calendar starting to finalize. And Mark, again, thank you for presenting this morning and spending your time with us. I found it very educational and very relevant to what we are doing currently. So, I mean, just right information at the right time. So I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. If I may indulge you for one more little point, as you were just talking about your HR topics and the use of technology, let me put on my equal employment opportunity issues person hat for a moment. Okay. And note that you all should be looking closely at the question of how artificial intelligence has come into the question of HR decisions. Yep. It's a fraught technology. It can be helpful. Good. It can be helpful in terms of processing large volumes, but it can also expose you, and you have to be careful how it's used. And finally, I guess to Peggy or Bethany, I'm happy to come back at a later date, maybe when this regulation goes final or some other point in the process, if you folks feel like you need to hear more about this thing, and by then you may not want to, but I'm happy to be a resource if you think that'd be helpful.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark.
Appreciate it. And I believe on the agenda that I sent out, Mark's contact information is on there if anyone wants to contact him directly. And as we get the letters and things from the chamber, I will be sure to forward those along to you guys in case your corporations would want to adapt, and it's always a good place to start instead of a blank page. So
thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that was interesting. Okay. I guess we're done at 9:30. Great. Thank you all. I will get this thrown up on YouTube right away, and I will send those the PowerPoint out to everybody. So the PDF of the PowerPoint. So all right. Thank you. Have a good Friday.
Thank
lots
you.
to chew on, lots to think about. All right. See ya.
Bye-bye.